In medieval times, death wasn't always a relief. For some people, it came slowly, painfully, and sometimes it never came when they begged for it. They were still alive, long after they wished they weren't. Tonight, we're going to explore some of the most painful execution methods ever used in medieval history. Not just how people died, but how they suffered before the end finally came. And in many cases, these punishments were given to people who may not have deserved them at all. Imagine being accused of a crime with no real evidence, no fair trial, and no way to defend yourself. Your fate is already decided, not just death, but something far worse. One of the cruelest methods was something known as the iron chair, a simple-looking seat made entirely of metal, covered in sharp spikes. The victim would be strapped tightly, unable to move, while heat was slowly applied beneath them. Not enough to kill them quickly, but just enough to make every second unbearable. Hours could pass, sometimes even longer, while the person remained still alive. You know, when people think about medieval executions, they usually imagine something fast, a sword, a single strike, and it's over. Clean, immediate, almost merciful, in a strange way. But the truth is, that kind of death was actually rare for most people, especially the poor, the accused, or the unlucky. Death wasn't something that came quickly. It was something that arrived slowly, painfully, and sometimes it felt like it would never come at all. Imagine this for a second. You're standing in a crowded town square. It's cold. The air smells like damp wood and smoke. People are gathered around not because they're forced to be there, but because they want to watch. For them, this is not just punishment, it's entertainment. And you're at the center of it. Your hands are tied. Your body is weak. Maybe you've been in a cell for days or weeks, barely eating, barely sleeping. You try to speak, maybe to explain yourself, but no one is listening anymore. The decision has already been made, and here's the part most people don't realize. In many of these cases, there wasn't even real evidence. Trials, as we understand them today, didn't really exist in the same way. Sometimes accusations were enough, sometimes fear was enough, and sometimes people were punished simply because others needed someone to blame. That's it. No proof, no second chance. Now here's something unsettling. In certain parts of medieval Europe, people actually believed that suffering before death was necessary. That pain somehow purified the soul. So instead of ending someone's life quickly, they would design punishments that stretched out the process. Not minutes, but hours, sometimes even days. Think about that. The goal wasn't just to execute. The goal was to make the person experience every moment of it. And if you think people always lost consciousness quickly, that's not true either. The human body is surprisingly resilient. Even under extreme pain, it can keep going far longer than you'd expect. There are records, disturbing ones, of victims who remained conscious, aware, begging, long after the punishment had begun. That's where the real horror is. Not just the pain, but the awareness of it, the waiting, the uncertainty of when it will finally end. Let me tell you something else that's rarely talked about. Execution methods weren't always designed by accident or tradition. Some of them were carefully thought out, engineered even. People experimented, they observed, they adjusted. If something caused more suffering, it was sometimes seen as more effective, more just. It's uncomfortable to think about, but in a way, this was a form of dark innovation. And here's a shocking fact that might stay with you. In some recorded cases, victims didn't die during the execution itself. They were taken down, still alive, and left to die slowly afterward, alone, wounded, exhausted. No crowd this time, no noise, just silence, and the slow realization that help was never coming. that the suffering wasn't over yet. Now I want you to notice something. None of this required advanced technology. No modern machines. No complex systems. Just basic tools, and a willingness to use them in ways that prolonged pain instead of ending it, which makes it feel even more personal, more direct, like every part of it was intentional. And maybe the most disturbing part of all is how normal it became. People brought their families to watch, children were there, vendors sold food nearby. It was treated like an event, something to talk about afterward, something to remember, not as a tragedy, but as a spectacle. So when we talk about the most painful execution methods, we're not just talking about physical pain, we're talking about a system, a mindset, a time when suffering was public, prolonged, and in many cases, completely undeserved. And this is just the beginning, because in the next part, we're going to look at one of the most infamous devices ever used, something that looked simple, almost harmless at first glance, but became one of the slowest and most agonizing ways a person could be punished. A chair, just a chair, but not the kind you're thinking of now. Before we even get into specific methods, there's something deeper you need to understand. Pain, in medieval times, wasn't just about punishment. It was about sending a message, and not just to the person being punished, but to everyone watching. Imagine standing in that crowd again. You're not the one tied up this time. You're just watching, but what you're really seeing is a warning, a very clear one. This could be you. And that fear, that was intentional. In fact, the more disturbing the execution, the more effective it was considered, because fear spreads faster than laws ever could. Alright, let's talk about something that, at first glance, doesn't even look that threatening. A chair. Just a chair. If I told you someone was going to be punished using a chair, you probably wouldn't imagine anything extreme, right? Maybe uncomfortable, maybe restrictive, but not horrifying. And that's exactly what makes this method so disturbing, because the iron chairs, called the chair of torment, was designed to look simple, almost ordinary. But the moment someone was forced onto it, everything changed. The surface wasn't smooth. It wasn't meant for sitting. It was covered, completely, in spikes. Not large enough to kill instantly, but sharp enough to make sure that every movement, every breath, came with pain. Now imagine being pushed down onto that chair. Not gently, not carefully. You're forced onto it. Your weight pressing against hundreds of small spikes, digging into your skin, your back, your legs, your arms, even the sides of your body. And then they strap you in, tight. Leather belts across your chest, your waist, your arms, sometimes even your head. At that point, it's not about sitting anymore. It's about being fixed in place, because the worst thing you could do was try to move. Every instinct in your body would tell you to shift, to escape the pressure, but any movement would only push the spikes deeper. So you're trapped in this impossible situation. Stay still and endure constant pain. Move and make it worse. Here's where it gets even more unsettling. The iron chair wasn't always used on its own. In some cases, heat was introduced slowly beneath it. Not a massive fire, nothing that would end things quickly, just enough warmth to turn the metal hot over time. And metal holds heat. It spreads it evenly, so as minutes passed, then hours, the entire surface would begin to warm up, gradually, almost unnoticeably at first, and then it wouldn't stop. The person sitting there wouldn't suddenly burn. It wasn't that fast. It was slower than that, much slower, which meant they had time to feel it, to realize what was happening, to understand that it was only going to get worse. And here's a detail that really sticks with people once they hear it. Victims placed in the iron chair didn't always die quickly. In fact, in many cases, they didn't die during the main event at all. They were taken off later if they survived covered in wounds, weakened, barely conscious, and left to deal with the aftermath. Some died from infection, some from blood loss, some from shock, but the execution itself, it wasn't always the final moment. It was just the beginning of a longer, slower end, and that's what makes this method so different from what most people expect when they think about execution. It wasn't a single act, it was a process. Now think about the crowd again, because there was almost always a crowd, people watching, observing, waiting, and here's the shocking part. Records suggest that some spectators didn't just watch in silence, they reacted, they commented, some even stayed for hours, just to see how long the person would last. It became a kind of endurance spectacle. Not officially, of course, but in practice. And the person in the chair, they were fully aware of it. The noise, the voices, the presence of people around them. Which means the suffering wasn't just physical, it was psychological too. Being seen in that state, unable to escape, knowing that others were witnessing every moment of it. That kind of pressure, that kind of awareness, adds a whole different layer to the experience. Now, here's something people don't usually think about. What happened after the chair? Because as brutal as the iron chair was, the real suffering didn't always end when someone was taken off it. In fact, for many victims, that was just the beginning of a different kind of pain. Imagine finally being unstrapped, your body weak, barely able to move, your skin torn in dozens of places. You might think, it's over, but it wasn't. Not really, because there was no real medical care waiting, no proper treatment, no relief. You were often left exactly as you were, injured, exposed, and expected to survive, or not. And here's where it gets unsettling in a quieter way. The wounds caused by the chair weren't always immediately fatal. They were deep enough to damage, but not always enough to end a life quickly, which meant infection became a very real risk. And in medieval times, infection wasn't something you could easily recover from. There were no antibiotics, no clean environments. Even a small wound could become deadly over time. Now imagine dozens of wounds across your entire body, each one a potential source of something worse. So even if someone survived the chair itself, they were often still facing a slow, uncertain outcome afterward. There are but they exist, of people who lingered for days after being subjected to this kind of punishment, not in a dramatic, loud way, but in silence. Weak breathing, fading awareness, the body slowly shutting down. And that's something that hits differently, isn't it? Because it's not the immediate shock people expect. It's the waiting, the gradual realization that the body isn't recovering, that whatever strength is left is slipping away bit by bit. And during that time, there wasn't always someone there to comfort them. In many cases, they were left alone. And here's a detail that might surprise you. Not every use of the iron chair was meant to end in death. In some cases, it was used as a form of interrogation or punishment, meant to extract confessions or enforce control, which means some people were put through this and expected to live afterward, to carry those injuries, to remember that experience, to go back into the world marked by it. And that adds another layer to everything we've talked about, because it wasn't always about execution. Sometimes it was about making sure the person and everyone else would never forget what happened in that chair. All right. Now imagine something that isn't hidden in a room or confined to a chair. Imagine something large, public, impossible to ignore. The kind of thing that, once you see it, stays in your mind for a long time. This method was known as the breaking wheel, and unlike the iron chair, which looked almost ordinary at first, this one didn't try to hide what it was meant for. It was a massive wooden wheel, sometimes similar to the ones used on carts, but repurposed into something far more disturbing. When people saw it being brought into a square, they already knew what was coming. There was no mystery, no illusion, just anticipation. Now, picture the moment it begins. The person is brought forward, usually already weak, sometimes injured, sometimes barely able to stand. They're laid down, and their limbs are positioned carefully. That word carefully feels strange here, doesn't it? But it's accurate, because this wasn't random violence. It followed a process. The arms, the legs, placed across sections of the wheel or wooden supports beneath it. And then, the executioner begins, not with a blade, but with a heavy tool, something designed to strike, not to cut. And the goal wasn't immediate death. It was something else entirely, something slower. Here's where it becomes difficult to think about. The strikes weren't aimed to end life quickly. They were aimed at the limbs, the bones, one by one, with pauses in between, not rushed, not chaotic, measured, which meant the person experiencing it had time to process each moment, time to feel the impact, the aftermath, and then wait for the next one. And that waiting, that space between, is what many accounts describe as one of the most unbearable parts, because the mind starts anticipating what's coming next, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. And here's a shocking detail that often gets overlooked. In some variations of this method, the number of strikes was predetermined, almost like a script. The executioner would follow a sequence sometimes called a pattern, deciding exactly how many blows would be delivered and where, which means this wasn't just punishment. It was structured, planned, and in certain cases, if the person lost consciousness too early, they would be revived, not out of mercy, but to continue the process. Just let that sink in for a second. The idea that someone might be brought back, not to be saved, but to endure more. And just like before, there was a crowd, always a crowd, but this time, it was even harder to look away, because everything was happening out in the open. Every movement, every strike, every reaction. People didn't have to imagine what was happening, they could see it. And that visibility made it more than just an execution. It turned it into something else, something closer to a display, a message made visible, and for the person at the center of it, there was no escaping that awareness, not just of the pain, but of being seen by everyone around them. Now, what makes the breaking wheel truly unsettling isn't just what happens during it, but what comes after. Because unlike what most people expect, the process didn't always end right there. In many cases, once the strikes were done, the person wasn't immediately taken away or given any kind of release. Instead, they were lifted carefully, again that word, and placed onto the wheel itself. Their body, bent, broken, arranged between the spokes, almost like they were being displayed, and then they were left there, not for minutes, but for hours, sometimes longer. Imagine that moment, the noise of the crowd slowly fading, the initial shock passing, and then there's just time to feel everything, time to notice every part of your body that no longer responds the way it should. Breathing becomes shallow, movement becomes impossible, but awareness can still remain. And that's what makes this stage so difficult to imagine, because it's not loud anymore, it's not chaotic, it's quiet, and in that quiet, the reality of what's happening starts to settle in. Here's something that might stay with you. In some historical accounts, victims placed on the wheel remained alive for extended periods, sometimes an entire day or more, not always fully conscious, but not completely gone either, drifting in and out, aware in moments, disconnected in others. And during that time, they weren't hidden away, they were left in public view, elevated, so people passing by could see them, which means the experience didn't end with the act itself. It continued, slowly, in full view of the world around them. And think about what that does to the mind. Even in a weakened state, there can still be flashes of awareness, sounds of footsteps, distant voices, maybe the wind, small details that remind you you're still there, still present, but unable to respond, unable to move. That kind of awareness, limited, fading, but still there, creates a different kind of discomfort. It's not just pain anymore. It's the sense of being stuck in a moment that isn't ending, of time stretching out in a way that feels unnatural. There's also something else that's rarely mentioned. Not every person subjected to the wheel died the same way. Some passed quickly after being placed there. Others lasted longer than expected. And in certain regions, there were even variations where the final moment was delayed intentionally, not rushed, not hidden, just allowed to happen slowly, which means the outcome wasn't always predictable. And that uncertainty, both for the person experiencing it and the people watching at it, another layer to everything. It wasn't just about what was happening, it was about how long it would last. And when it was finally over, the wheel didn't just disappear, it stayed there, sometimes for days, sometimes longer, a visible reminder, not just of one person, but of what could happen, a message left behind without words. And maybe that's the part that lingers the most, not just the act itself, but how it remained, even after it was done. Alright, when you hear the word hanging, you probably imagine something quick, a drop, a snap, and then it's over. That's the version most people know today, but in medieval times, it didn't always work like that. In fact, more often than not, it was much slower. There was no carefully calculated drop, no measured rope length, just a simple setup, a rope, a beam, and gravity doing the rest in a very gradual way, which means instead of an instant end, what people experienced was something drawn out, something that relied on time rather than force. Now imagine standing there, the rope already around your neck. You can feel the rough fibers against your skin, tight, but not crushing. Not yet. There's a moment, just a small one, where everything is still. The crowd is watching. Maybe it's quiet, maybe there's noise, but either way, you're aware of it. And then, the support beneath you is taken away. Not a sudden drop from a height, just enough to leave you suspended. And that's when the real experience begins. Because, instead of a quick end, the body reacts slowly. Breathing becomes difficult, not impossible at first, just restricted, and that restriction builds, second by second. Here's something a lot of people don't realize. In this kind of hanging, the neck doesn't necessarily break. That means the person remains conscious for longer than expected. The body struggles. Instinct kicks in. Every part of you tries to find air, to adjust, to relieve the pressure, but there's nowhere to go, no way to change position enough to stop what's happening, and time starts to stretch. What might seem like a short moment from the outside can feel much longer from within, because when breathing becomes limited, every second becomes noticeable. And here's a detail that's both simple and unsettling. The process could be affected by very small things. The thickness of the rope, the height of the beam, even the weight of the person. Nothing was standardized. Nothing was controlled the way it is today, which means the outcome wasn't always predictable. Some people lost consciousness relatively quickly. Others didn't. There are accounts suggesting that in certain cases, it could take several minutes before the person fully faded, and during that time, movement, reflexes, reactions, they were all visible, not hidden, not silent. Now think about the crowd again, because just like the other methods, this wasn't done in isolation. People watched, they waited, and in some cases, they stayed until the very end, not because they had to, but because it was expected, normal, even, and for the person at the center of it, that awareness didn't disappear. Even as the body weakened, there could still be moments of recognition, sounds, shapes, the sense of being there in front of others. And that combination, struggle and public exposure, created an experience that was very different from the instant version people imagine today. Now, what happens after the moment itself is something people rarely think about, because when we imagine hanging, we usually focus on the act, not the aftermath. But in medieval times, the body wasn't always taken down right away. In many cases, it was left there, suspended, still, as if the scene needed to remain visible for a while longer. And that changes the entire feeling of it, because it's no longer just an event. It becomes a presence, something that stays, even after everything is technically over. Imagine the crowd slowly dispersing, the noise fades, the square becomes quieter, but the figure is still there, hanging in the same place, unmoving now. People pass by, some glance, some avoid looking altogether, but either way, it's seen, and that visibility was part of the purpose, not just punishment, but reminder, a silent message that didn't need words. Just the image alone was enough, and the longer it stayed there, the deeper that message settled into the minds of those who saw it. Here's something that might surprise you. In certain places, bodies were intentionally left for extended periods, not just hours, but sometimes days, not out of neglect, but as a form of continuation, a way of extending the impact beyond the moment itself, which means the execution didn't really end when the person lost consciousness. It lingered in sight, in memory, in the daily lives of people who walked past that same spot again and again. That kind of repetition has a different effect. It doesn't shock in a single moment. It settles in slowly. And if you think about it from a human perspective, there's something deeply uncomfortable about that stillness. Because even without movement, the image carries weight. The position, the silence, the way time seems to pause around it for just a second when someone notices. It's not loud or dramatic anymore. It's quiet. And sometimes, quiet is harder to process, because it gives your mind space to fill in the gaps, to imagine what happened before, to reflect on how it ended. There's also the question of how people responded internally. Not everyone reacted the same way. Some may have seen it as justice. Others may have felt something else entirely. Discomfort, unease, even if they didn't say it out loud. And that's something we don't always get from historical records, what people felt in those moments. But it's not hard to imagine that standing in front of something like that, day after day, might leave a lasting impression, even if it was never openly discussed. And when the body was finally taken down, the space didn't immediately return to normal. Something lingered, not physically, but mentally. People remembered, they talked, they pointed, and over time, those stories became part of the place itself, which means the impact of a single execution could extend far beyond the moment it happened. It became part of memory, part of routine, part of how people understood consequences in that world. Alright, this one feels different from everything we've talked about so far. There's no heavy device, no dramatic setup in a public square, no sudden movement that signals the beginning. In fact, it often starts in a place that feels almost ordinary. A small room, a cell, maybe dimly lit, maybe completely dark. The door closes, and that's it. No immediate pain, no visible action, just time, and the quiet understanding that something essential is about to be taken away, not all at once, but slowly, day by day. At first, it might not even feel like punishment. Hunger is something the body knows how to handle, at least in the beginning. You wait. You expect something to change. Maybe food will come later. Maybe this is temporary. But then hours pass, then a full day, and nothing arrives. The body starts to adjust, but not in a comfortable way. There's a dull feeling at first, then a sharper awareness. Every small movement reminds you of it. Your thoughts start circling around one thing. When will this end? And the unsettling part is, there's no clear answer. Here's something people don't always realize. Starvation isn't a straight line from fine to gone. It's a process with stages, and each stage feels different. After a couple of days, the body begins to conserve energy. Movements become slower, speech becomes softer, even thinking can feel heavier, not dramatic, just gradually harder. And during this time, awareness can still be very much there. You notice the passing of time, the change in light, the sounds outside. Small details become more noticeable because there's nothing else to focus on. And here's a detail that often surprises people. In some cases, individuals subjected to this kind of punishment were not completely deprived of everything. Sometimes they were given small amounts of water, just enough to keep the body going a little longer, not enough to restore strength, but enough to extend the process, which means the experience didn't move quickly toward an end. It stretched quietly, almost invisibly from the outside, and that extension, that deliberate slowing, is what made it so difficult. Now think about the environment. Unlike the public methods we talked about before, this often happened out of sight. No crowd, no noise, just walls, maybe a small opening, and in that space, time behaves differently, without distractions. Minutes can feel longer, hours can blur together, and the mind starts to drift, not in a peaceful way, but in a way that feels uncertain. Thoughts come and go, focus shifts, and all the while, the body continues its slow adjustment, conserving what little energy remains. Now, after enough time has passed, something begins to change. Not suddenly, but gradually. The sharp feeling of hunger that was there at the beginning starts to fade, and that might sound like relief, but it's not really. It's more like the body shifting into a different state, a quieter one. Movements become slower. Even lifting your head can feel like it takes effort. And your thoughts, they don't disappear, but they don't move the same way anymore. They come in fragments, pieces, sometimes clear, sometimes distant, and in that space, time feels harder to measure. Imagine sitting there, or lying down, not because you choose to, but because it's the only thing your body allows. You're aware of the room, the walls, maybe a faint sound from outside, but everything feels slightly removed, like there's a layer between you and the world. And here's the unsettling part. This stage can last, not just hours, but days. The body, even in a weakened state, can continue longer than people expect. And during that time, there can still be moments of awareness, not constant, but enough to notice that you're still there. Here's something that often surprises people. In historical records, there are mentions of individuals who remained, conscious at least, partially far into this process, not alert in the usual sense, but aware enough to respond in small ways, a shift, a sound, a reaction, which means the experience wasn't always one of complete absence. It was something in between, a state where the body is fading, but the mind hasn't fully followed yet, and that in-between space is difficult to describe, but it's often where the longest moments seem to happen. And think about the environment again. No crowd this time, no one watching, no reactions, just stillness. And in that stillness, there's no distraction from what's happening. The body slowing down, the breath becoming lighter, the sense of time stretching out. It's not dramatic, it's not loud, but it's persistent. And sometimes, that persistence is what makes it feel heavier, because there's no clear moment where everything changes. It's a gradual shift from one state to another, almost without noticing exactly when it happens. There's also something else to consider. Not every case followed the exact same pattern. Some people lost awareness earlier, others remained in that in-between state longer than expected, and without precise records of every moment, we're left with fragments, descriptions, observations, pieces of information that suggest how varied the experience could be, which means there isn't a single timeline. There isn't one way it always ended, and that uncertainty adds another layer to everything we've talked about. And when it was finally over, there wasn't always a clear end scene. No crowd dispersing, no visible marker, just silence, a space that returns to stillness, as if nothing had happened there at all. But of course, something did, and even if it wasn't seen, it leaves an impression, not loud, not immediate, but something that lingers in a quieter way. Alright, now imagine something that most people think they already understand. Fire. When you hear burning, you probably picture something fast, intense, immediate, but in many medieval executions, it wasn't designed to be quick. It was controlled, slowed down, almost measured, and that changes everything, because instead of a sudden end, what people experienced was a gradual rise. Heat that didn't overwhelm instantly, but built over time, slowly, steadily, leaving space for awareness in between. Picture the setting, a wooden structure stacked carefully, not randomly thrown together, but arranged with intention. The person is placed at the center, secured so they can't move freely. And here's something people don't always realize. The fire didn't start as a massive blaze. It began small, low flames, smoke first, the kind that fills the air before anything else really happens. And in those early moments, the experience isn't what most people expect. It's not immediate pain, it's discomfort, heat that's noticeable, but not overwhelming yet. And that delay, that space before things intensify, is what makes it unsettling. Now here's a shocking detail that often gets overlooked. In some historical accounts, the materials used in these setups were chosen specifically to control how quickly the fire spread, not too fast, not too slow, which means the experience could be prolonged intentionally, and that's hard to process, right? The idea that something like this wasn't left to chance, but adjusted, managed, almost like someone was deciding how long the process should last. It wasn't always chaotic. In many cases, it followed a kind of quiet structure, and just like the other methods, there was usually a crowd, but this time, the experience was different for them too, because fire is visible in a way other methods aren't. Light, movement, smoke, it draws attention. People could see the progression, the change from small flames to something stronger, and for the person at the center of it, that visibility didn't disappear. Even as the environment changed, there could still be moments of awareness, sounds of movement, shifting air, the presence of people around them, which means the experience wasn't just physical, it was layered with everything happening outside of it. Here's another shocking fact that stays with people once they hear it. Not every case ended the same way or in the same amount of time. Some individuals lost awareness relatively early in the process, others didn't. And in certain records, there are suggestions that external factors like weather, materials, even positioning could affect how long everything lasted, which means the outcome wasn't always predictable. And that uncertainty added another level of tension, both for the person experiencing it and for those watching. And when it was over, the space didn't immediately return to normal. The structure remained, at least for a while. The marks were visible, the ground changed, and just like the other methods we've talked about, the impact didn't end with the moment itself. It lingered in the place, in memory, in the quiet conversations that followed afterward. because what people witnessed wasn't something easily forgotten. Now, when everything finally settles, what's left behind isn't just a memory of the moment, but the space itself. Because unlike other methods, this one changes the environment in a very visible way. The structure that once stood doesn't look the same anymore. The ground beneath it isn't untouched. And for the people who were there, or even those who arrive later, there's a quiet understanding that something happened here, not loudly, not all at once, but in a way that unfolded over time. Imagine the crowd slowly leaving, the light fades, the air feels different, warmer at first, then gradually returning to normal. But even as everything calms down, there's a kind of stillness that remains, and in that stillness, people tend to reflect, even if they don't say it out loud, because witnessing something that unfolds slowly leaves a different kind of impression than something quick. It doesn't shock and disappear. It settles. It stays in the background of your thoughts. Here's a shocking detail that often isn't talked about much. In some historical accounts, the remains were not always removed immediately. Sometimes the site was left as it was, for a period of time, not as an accident, but as a continuation of the message, which means the end wasn't really a clean break. It extended, quietly, visibly. And for people passing by later, the experience wasn't just something they heard about, it was something they could still see traces of. And that kind of visibility has a lasting effect. There's also something to consider about how people processed it afterward. Not everyone reacted the same way. Some may have accepted it as justice, as something expected. Others may have felt a kind of discomfort they couldn't fully explain. And that's the part history doesn't always record clearly, what people felt when they walked away. But it's not hard to imagine that seeing something unfold slowly in front of you might stay in your mind longer than something immediate. And here's another shocking fact. Over time, these events didn't just disappear into history. They became stories, retold, repeated, sometimes changed slightly with each telling, but still rooted in the same moment. Which means the impact didn't stop with the people who were physically there. It spread through conversations, through memory, through the way people described what they had seen to others who weren't there. And in that way, the experience continued long after the physical event had ended. So when we think about methods like this, it's not just about what happened during the act itself. It's about what remains afterward, the space, the memory, the quiet understanding that something slow, something prolonged, once took place there. And that kind of impact doesn't disappear quickly. It lingers in ways that are harder to see, but just as real. Alright. This time, there's no fire, no crowd in a large open square, no dramatic structure that everyone can see from a distance. Instead, imagine a room, enclosed, quiet, maybe lit just enough to see what's happening, but not bright. And in the center of that room, there's a wooden frame, simple at first glance, just beams, rollers, and ropes. Nothing about it looks extreme until you understand what it's meant to do. This device was known as the rack, and unlike the other methods we've talked about, its purpose wasn't always immediate execution. It was control, precision, and time. Now imagine being placed onto it, your wrists secured, your ankles tied at the opposite end. At first, there's tension, but nothing unbearable yet, just enough to hold you in place. And then, slowly, the mechanism begins to move, not suddenly, not violently, just a gradual turning. The ropes tighten, your body stretches slightly. At first, it might feel like pressure, like your muscles resisting, but then it continues, a little more, and a little more. And that's when the body starts to reach a point it wasn't meant to go beyond, not instantly, but progressively. Here's where it becomes difficult to ignore. The rack wasn't about one moment, It was about a series of moments, each turn of the mechanism followed by a pause, and in that pause, there's awareness, a chance to feel exactly what changed, to notice the difference between before and now, and then another turn and another pause. It's that rhythm movement, stillness, movement again that creates a different kind of tension because it's not continuous. It gives the mind time to anticipate what's coming next. Now here's a shocking fact that often surprises people. In some historical accounts, this device wasn't used to end life directly, but to force confessions, which means the process could stop and start again, repeatedly, depending on what the person said or didn't say. And that changes the entire dynamic, because it's no longer a single event with a clear beginning and end. It becomes something uncertain, something that could continue as long as needed. And that uncertainty can be just as difficult as the physical experience itself. And here's another detail that adds to it. The body doesn't respond the same way every time. At first, there's resistance, then fatigue, then a kind of weakness that builds slowly. Movements become limited, not because you choose to stay still, but because there's no other option. And during all of this, awareness can still be present, not always sharp, but enough to register what's happening, enough to feel the progression, and that gradual shift from tension to a different kind of experience than the more immediate methods we've talked about before. And just like before, there were witnesses, maybe not always a large crowd, but people were there, observing, waiting, listening, because this wasn't just about the person on the rack. It was about the outcome, the result, the message, and that presence, even in a quieter setting, adds another layer, because it means the experience isn't completely private. There's still an awareness of being seen, even in a space that feels more controlled. Now, when the mechanism finally stops, there's a moment of stillness. No more turning, no more movement from the device itself, just silence, and the body left exactly where it is. And that silence can feel strange, almost heavier than the process before it, because during the movement, there's something to focus on, something happening. But when it stops, there's nothing but the aftermath. The body doesn't immediately return to normal. It can't. Everything has been pushed beyond its natural limits, slowly, step by step, and now it has to exist in that state. Imagine being unfastened from the frame, not suddenly, but carefully, because even small movements now feel different. The body is weaker, less responsive, and here's something people don't always think about. Happens next isn't always clear or immediate. In some cases, the person wasn't taken away to recover. They were simply removed and left to deal with whatever condition they were in. And that condition could vary. Sometimes they could still move, slowly, sometimes not at all. Here's a shocking fact that often surprises people. Not everyone who went through this process died from it. Some survived, which means they carried the effects afterward, physically and mentally. And that adds a different kind of weight to everything we've talked about, because it wasn't always a final moment. For some, it became something they had to live with, a memory that didn't fade quickly, a reminder that stayed with them long after the event itself had ended. And think about the mental side of that, because even when the physical process stops, the awareness doesn't just disappear. The memory of each moment, the gradual tension, the pauses, the anticipation can linger, not loudly, but quietly, in the background. And in a setting where there are no distractions, no immediate change of environment, that memory can feel closer, more present. It's not something that ends cleanly. It fades slowly. If it fades at all, there's also something else to consider. The people who witnessed it, whether directly or indirectly, always walk away unchanged. Even in a quieter space, observing something that unfolds slowly, with clear stages, can leave an impression. Not necessarily something they talk about openly, but something that stays. And over time, those impressions become part of how these events are remembered, not just as isolated moments, but as experiences that had a lasting effect on everyone involved. And when the room is finally empty, when the device is still, and everything returns to silence, there's a sense that something has passed through that space, something controlled, measured, but still difficult to fully process. Unlike the other methods we've explored, it doesn't just end, it lingers, in memory, in atmosphere, in the quiet understanding of what once took place there. So, when we look back at all of this, the iron chair, the wheel, the rope, the fire, the slow silence of a locked room, the measured turning of a device, it's easy to focus on the methods themselves, the tools, the structures, the process. But maybe the more important question isn't what was used, but why it was accepted, because none of these things existed in isolation. They were part of a system, a way of thinking, a time when pain wasn't always seen the same way we see it now. And here's something worth sitting with for a moment. Many of these punishments weren't hidden, they were visible, public, sometimes even expected, which means people lived alongside them, not as rare events, but as something woven into everyday life. And that changes how we understand it, because it wasn't just about a few isolated moments in history. It was about a mindset that allowed those moments to happen again and again. Now here's a shocking thought, not about the past, but about how we look at it today. It's easy to imagine that we would have reacted differently, that we would have seen it as wrong immediately. But history isn't always that simple. People are shaped by the time they live in, by what they're taught to accept, by what feels normal around them. And in those moments, many didn't question it the way we do now, which makes it less about judging them, and more about understanding how powerful those systems can be. At the same time, there's something else here, something quieter. Not every person who witnessed these events necessarily felt the same way. Some may have accepted it. Others may have felt something they couldn't fully explain, discomfort, unease, a sense that something wasn't right, even if they didn't have the words for it. And those small, unspoken reactions, they matter too, because they remind us that even in the middle of something widely accepted, there can still be moments of doubt. And maybe that's where this kind of history becomes more than just a collection of events. It becomes a reflection, not just of what happened, but of how people respond to what's around them, how quickly something can become normal, and how slowly that normal can change. Because over time, these practices didn't disappear all at once. They faded, gradually, as ideas shifted, as perspectives changed, as people began to see things differently. So as you sit with all of this, maybe the takeaway isn't just about how painful these methods were. It's about how complex the past can be, how difficult it is to fully understand it, and how important it is to approach it with a sense of awareness, not just of what happened, but of how it was experienced by the people who lived through it. And now, as everything settles, as the stories come to an end, there's nothing left to watch. No crowd, no movement, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after something long, something heavy, something that doesn't fully disappear the moment it's over. And here's another detail that adds to it. The body doesn't respond the same way every time. At first, there's resistance, then fatigue, then a kind of weakness that builds slowly. Movements become limited, not because you choose to stay still, but because there's no other option. And during all of this, awareness can still be present, not always sharp, but enough to register what's happening, enough to feel the progression, and that gradual shift from tension to a different kind of experience. than the more immediate methods we've talked about before. And just like before, there were witnesses, maybe not always a large crowd, but people were there, observing, waiting, listening, because this wasn't just about the person on the rack. It was about the outcome, the result, the message, and that presence, even in a quieter setting, adds another layer, because it means the experience isn't completely private. There's still an awareness of being seen, even in a space that feels more controlled. Now, when the mechanism finally stops, there's a moment of stillness. No more turning, no more movement from the device itself, just silence, and the body left exactly where it is. And that silence can feel strange, almost heavier than the process before it, because during the movement, there's something to focus on, something happening. But when it stops, there's nothing but the aftermath. The body doesn't immediately return to normal. It can't. Everything has been pushed beyond its natural limits, slowly, step by step, and now it has to exist in that state. Imagine being unfastened from the frame, not suddenly, but carefully, because even small movements now feel different. The body is weaker, less responsive, and here's something people don't always think about. Happens next isn't always clear or immediate. In some cases, the person wasn't taken away to recover. They were simply removed and left to deal with whatever condition they were in. And that condition could vary. Sometimes they could still move, slowly, sometimes not at all. Here's a shocking fact that often surprises people. Not everyone who went through this process died from it. Some survived, which means they carried the effects afterward, physically and mentally. And that adds a different kind of weight to everything we've talked about, because it wasn't always a final moment. For some, it became something they had to live with, a memory that didn't fade quickly, a reminder that stayed with them long after the event itself had ended. And think about the mental side of that, because even when the physical process stops, the awareness doesn't just disappear. The memory of each moment, the gradual tension, the pauses, the anticipation can linger, not loudly, but quietly, in the background. And in a setting where there are no distractions, no immediate change of environment, that memory can feel closer, more present. It's not something that ends cleanly. It fades slowly. If it fades at all, there's also something else to consider. The people who witnessed it, whether directly or indirectly, always walk away unchanged. Even in a quieter space, observing something that unfolds slowly, with clear stages, can leave an impression. Not necessarily something they talk about openly, but something that stays. And over time, those impressions become part of how these events are remembered, not just as isolated moments, but as experiences that had a lasting effect on everyone involved. And when the room is finally empty, when the device is still, and everything returns to silence, there's a sense that something has passed through that space, something controlled, measured, but still difficult to fully process. Unlike the other methods we've explored, it doesn't just end, it lingers, in memory, in atmosphere, in the quiet understanding of what once took place there. So, when we look back at all of this, the iron chair, the wheel, the rope, the fire, the slow silence of a locked room, the measured turning of a device, it's easy to focus on the methods themselves, the tools, the structures, the process. But maybe the more important question isn't what was used, but why it was accepted, because none of these things existed in isolation. They were part of a system, a way of thinking, a time when pain wasn't always seen the same way we see it now. And here's something worth sitting with for a moment. Many of these punishments weren't hidden, they were visible, public, sometimes even expected, which means people lived alongside them, not as rare events, but as something woven into everyday life. And that changes how we understand it, because it wasn't just about a few isolated moments in history. It was about a mindset that allowed those moments to happen again and again. Now here's a shocking thought, not about the past, but about how we look at it today. It's easy to imagine that we would have reacted differently, that we would have seen it as wrong immediately. But history isn't always that simple. People are shaped by the time they live in, by what they're taught to accept, by what feels normal around them. And in those moments, many didn't question it the way we do now, which makes it less about judging them and more about understanding how powerful those systems can be. At the same time, there's something else here, something quieter. Not every person who witnessed these events necessarily felt the same way. Some may have accepted it. Others may have felt something they couldn't fully explain: discomfort, unease, a sense that something wasn't right, even if they didn't have the words for it. And those small, unspoken reactions, they matter too, because they remind us that even in the middle of something widely accepted, there can still be moments of doubt. And maybe that's where this kind of history becomes more than just a collection of events. It becomes a reflection, not just of what happened, but of how people respond to what's around them, how quickly something can become normal, and how slowly that normal can change. Because over time, these practices didn't disappear all at once. They faded gradually, as ideas shifted, as perspectives changed, as people began to see things differently. So as you sit with all of this, maybe the takeaway isn't just about how painful these methods were. It's about how complex the past can be, how difficult it is to fully understand it, and how important it is to approach it with a sense of awareness, not just of what happened, but of how it was experienced by the people who lived through it. And now, as everything settles, as the stories come to an end, there's nothing left to watch. No crowd, no movement, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after something long, something heavy, something that doesn't fully disappear the moment it's over.